The year is 1958, and America is a nation suffering from a magnificent, high-speed identity crisis. If you had stood on a suburban street corner that year, you would have felt the very ground shaking beneath the weight of progress. Overhead, the sky was no longer a mystery. It was a battlefield. The Soviet Sputnik had just punctured the firmament, and the United States had retaliated by hurling the Explorer 1 satellite into the void. Suddenly, every citizen from Maine to California wasn't just looking at the road ahead, they were staring at the stars. The culture had shifted from the kitchen to the cosmos, and the American consumer demanded that their life reflect this new, supersonic reality. They wanted their televisions to look like radar screens and their refrigerators to hum like jet engines. But most of all, they wanted their cars to look like they could break the sound barrier before they even left the driveway. This was the moment that should have belonged to General Motors, the undisputed king-of-the-hill titan of Detroit. But instead of grabbing the future by the throat, the giant stumbled. While their rivals at Chrysler were crafting sleek, predatory machines that looked like they were born in a wind tunnel, GM's 1958 lineup arrived looking like it had been dragged through a jewelry store with a giant magnet. They didn't build spaceships, they built rolling, chrome-plated fortresses. It was the mistake of 1958, a corporate disaster so heavy it threatened to sink the world's largest company. Yet, this is not a story of failure. It is a story of a secret midnight rebellion. It is the story of how a group of young, desperate designers staged a creative coup to save an empire, leading to the birth of the most legendary, fin-clipped icons the world has ever seen. To understand how GM fell into the chrome trap and how they clawed their way back to immortality, we have to look behind the curtain of the most aggressive styling war in human history. In the mid-1950s, Detroit was more than an industrial hub. It was a theater of war, where the primary weapons were clay, charcoal, and chrome. The era of the jelly bean car, those rounded, modest shapes of the late 40s, was dead. We had entered the age of planned obsolescence, a term coined by GM's own styling genius, Harley Earl. The goal was simple: make last year's car look like an ancient relic, and this year's car look like a miracle. To do this, designers turned to the military-industrial complex for inspiration. Every new model became a rolling tribute to the Air Force. We saw hood ornaments that mirrored the sleek fuselage of the North American F-86 Saberjet. We saw dashboards that looked like the cockpit of a B-52 bomber. This wasn't just transportation, it was psychological warfare. Marketing departments went into overdrive, inventing a lexicon of the future to lure buyers into showrooms. You weren't just shifting gears. You were operating a teletouch push-button transmission. You weren't just looking through glass. You were peering through a panoramic vista shield. Features didn't have to be practical. In fact, many were notoriously unreliable, but they were symbols. They told your neighbors that you were a man of the atomic age, a man who wasn't afraid of the fast-approaching 1960s. At the center of this hurricane sat Harley Earl, the first man to ever lead a dedicated styling department for a major automaker. By 1958, Earl wasn't just an executive, he was a god. He had invented the concept car, he had pioneered the use of full-scale clay modeling, and he had spent 3 decades dictating what America thought was beautiful. But even gods can lose touch with the mortals they rule, and Harley Earl's obsession with more was about to collide head-on with a changing world. The absolute authority of Harley Earl was both GM's greatest strength and its fatal flaw. He believed in a very specific, mid-century brand of luxury: mass, weight, and brilliance. To Earl, if a car was expensive, it had to look expensive, and the only way to signal wealth was to pile on the chrome. He wanted his cars to look like rolling monuments. He would walk through the studios, and with a single grunt or a flick of his cigar, he could kill a design that had taken months to perfect. He favored thick, heavy proportions and layered ornamentation. Under his watch, GM cars became wider and heavier every year. But while Earl was focused on the shine, a young, eagle-eyed designer named Chuck Jordan was focused on the competition. One afternoon in 1956, Jordan did something that was strictly forbidden in the insular world of Detroit. He went for a walk past the gates of the Chrysler plant. What he saw there through a chain-link fence would haunt his dreams and change automotive history forever. Sitting in the Chrysler test lot were the 1,957 Plymouths designed by the legendary Virgil Exner. They weren't just new, they were alien. They were lower than anything GM had on the drawing board. They had razor-sharp, soaring tail fins and an airy, glass-heavy forward look that made them appear to be leaping forward even when they were perfectly still. Jordan stood there, gripped by a sudden, icy realization. These cheap Plymouths looked more modern and more expensive than the high-end Cadillacs his own team was slaving over. He rushed back to the GM Technical Center like a man fleeing a fire, cornering Bill Mitchell, the number 2 man in the styling department. The message was clear. The war is over, and we just lost. The panic that swept through the GM design studios was palpable, but they were trapped by the brutal physics of the industrial calendar. In Detroit, it takes years to turn a sketch into a piece of stamped steel. The 1,958 models were already locked. The massive dies were being cast, the supply chains were set, and the billions of dollars were already spent. General Motors was a supertanker that couldn't turn on a dime. They were forced to watch as their 1,958 lineup, the heaviest, most chrome-laden cars in history, rolled off the assembly lines and into a market that had suddenly developed a taste for Exner's sleek, aerodynamic shapes. The result was a massacre in the showrooms. The 1,958 Oldsmobile was so cluttered with useless chrome strips that the public mockingly labeled it the Chrome-mobile. The 1,958 Buick Limited was even worse. It featured a grille that looked like a wall of hundreds of gleaming chrome squares, a visual assault that felt more like a cry for help than a design statement. Even the Cadillac, usually the gold standard of taste, looked bloated and confused, with a sagging beltline that lacked any of the crisp elegance of the past. GM had bet on more, and the public responded with no. It was the ultimate corporate nightmare. The world's most powerful company was peddling yesterday's news at tomorrow's prices. But while the executives were sweating over the sales charts, a secret revolution was brewing in the basement. Bill Mitchell, a man with a fiery temper and an even hotter vision for the future, knew that if they followed Harley Earl's lead for the 1,959 models, GM would be finished as a style leader. He waited for his moment. When Harley Earl left for a weeks-long vacation to Europe, Mitchell gathered the young, hungry designers, men like Chuck Jordan and Dave Halls, and gave them an order that was essentially corporate heresy. "Forget everything Earl told you," he said. "Forget the chrome. Forget the bulk. We're going to design the 1,959 cars from scratch, right now, in the dark." It was a race against time. Working in total secrecy, the designers began to sketch shapes that were the polar opposite of the 1,958 disaster. They drew cars that were flatter than a pancake and wider than a sidewalk. They threw away the heavy chrome trim and focused on pure, clean lines and massive, sweeping glass. They pushed the X-frame chassis to its absolute limit, dropping the body so low that the cars looked like they were hugging the earth. The energy in the studio was electric. They weren't just designing cars, they were trying to save their own reputations. When Harley Earl finally returned from Europe and walked into the viewing room, he didn't find the heavy, upright models he expected. He found a room full of low-slung, needle-nosed, finned monsters. He stood there for a long time, the silence stretching like a rubber band. Finally, he looked at Mitchell and said, "Okay, Bill, go ahead." The result of that silent coup was the 1,959 General Motors lineup, a collection of cars so radical, so daring, and so beautiful that they remain the ultimate symbols of the American century. The 1,959 Chevrolet was the breakout star. It featured the famous Batwing rear-end huge, horizontal fins that spread out like a hawk in flight, accented by cat-eye taillights that glowed with a sinister, futuristic intensity. It was a car that looked like it had been stolen from a movie set in the year 2000. The 1,959 Pontiac introduced the wide track stance, pushing the wheels further out to the corners of the body, creating a look of aggressive stability that would define the brand for 30 years. The 1959 Oldsmobile found its soul again, trading the chrome-mobile clutter for long, clean, linear-look styling that exuded quiet, high-tech confidence. But the undisputed king was the 1959 Cadillac. It featured the tallest, most outrageous tail fins ever put on a production car, twin bullets of red light perched on top of soaring blades of steel. It was the absolute peak of American optimism. It was a middle finger to gravity and a love letter to the moon landing. The 1959 models didn't just sell, they dominated. They reclaimed GM's throne and made everyone else look like they were still living in the Stone Age. The 1959 turnaround was more than a commercial success. It was a cultural explosion. It proved that in the world of high-stakes design, your biggest failure is often the only thing that can teach you how to achieve your biggest win. If the 1958 models hadn't been such bloated, chrome-choked disasters, Bill Mitchell and his team never would have had the courage or the permission to push the 1959 designs to such radical extremes. The mistake of 1958 was the fuel that powered the miracle of 1959. These cars became the canvases for the American dream, immortalized in every medium, from the pop art of Andy Warhol to the rock and roll lyrics of the 60s. They set the template for the next decade of automotive history, forcing Ford and Chrysler to completely abandon their own plans just to stay in the race. Even today, when you see a 1959 Cadillac or Chevy at a car show, it still commands the air around it. It doesn't just look like a car, it looks like an era. It reminds us of a time when America wasn't afraid to be loud, wasn't afraid to be daring, and wasn't afraid to throw away the past to grab a hold of the future. The saga of General Motors in the late 50s is the ultimate lesson in corporate survival. It tells us that power is nothing without vision, and that even the most massive giants must be willing to burn their old playbooks to survive a changing world. It reminds us that behind every great machine is a group of people who were willing to risk their careers on a sketch and a dream. The chrome battleships of 1958 are now mostly forgotten, rusted away in the scrap heaps of history. But the spaceships of 1959, they are immortal. They are still flying down the highways of our imagination, their tail fins slicing through the air, reminding us that sometimes you have to hit rock bottom before you can reach the stars. So, the next time you feel like you've made a monumental mistake, just remember the designers at GM. Your 1958 might be a disaster, but your 1959 could be a masterpiece that changes the world forever.